Hello, everyone. My name is Oliver Subasinger, and I'm with USAID's Water Office in Washington, D.C. We're going to go ahead and get the webinar started. First, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today to hear about the fourth in our series of independent ex post evaluations that USAID is supporting to better understand factors that influence the sustainability of water and sanitation activities after a project ends and help inform future USAID investments in the sector. The series is being conducted by USAID's Water Communications and Knowledge Management, or CKM Project. Today's webinar will present findings from the ex post evaluation of the Indonesia Environmental Services Program, implemented by DAI Global between 2004 and 2010. 7 years after the close of the project, the evaluation team used mixed methodology design, including utility service level and performance data, as well as qualitative interviews to examine the enduring influence of selected ESP achievements in improving water utilities service levels, as well as utilities management capacity and financial stability. The evaluation also verified the present status of microcredit programs designed to improve access to the poor. Lessons from this evaluation are intended to inform improvements on ongoing USAID urban water and sanitation activities in Indonesia and beyond. Our presenter today is Greene Hodel, a senior technical specialist with social impact, playing a senior advisory role to the ex post evaluation series for the water CKM contract and on the ESP evaluation. She has more than 11 years of experience in evaluation design, management, and analysis in a variety of sectors. We'll also be joined today by our moderator, Holly Dentz, a M&E specialist at Social Impact for the ex post evaluation series and a member of USAID Water Office CKM Project. She also has over 10 years of experience in the water and sanitation sector. She will moderate today's webinar discussion and Q&A session. In terms of our agenda today, you can submit questions at any time during the presentations in the chat box on your screen, but questions will not be answered until the end of the presentation. If you're having technical issues during the webinar, let us know in the chat box and we'll do our best to resolve them. I also need to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded and we will be sharing the recording next week through a link that'll go out by email and on Twitter. You can find the slides from today's presentation in that email as well. The full report of the evaluation and shorter evaluation brief will be out soon, and all resources will be shared on USAID's Water Sector Knowledge Hub, globalwaters.org. Now I'll turn things over to Holly.
Yes, great, thank you. So quick, just want to discuss my role and then hopefully your role as participants. My role is to facilitate the question and answer session at the end. In case anyone is wondering, all the participants you will be muted, and your best way to communicate is through the chat box, as Oliver indicated. So to make this a productive question and answer period, I would encourage all participants to share questions, comments, and just any feedback you have throughout the presentation. I will compile those thoughts and then facilitate the question and answer session with Leslie at the end. And then as well, certainly, as he mentioned, if there's any other challenges, please put those in the chat box and we will try to address them. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Leslie to begin the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. Hello, everyone. I'm Greene Hodel, and thank you for the introduction. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to share our evaluation findings with you. As Oliver mentioned, I was a technical advisor to the design and analysis of this evaluation, and I'm presenting on behalf of our whole evaluation team, which included Annette Fay, who contributed heavily to analysis and also led fieldwork in Indonesia. And then we had Indonesian technical specialists, Enrico Rahadi and Elena Vijayawati. We were also supported by Amanda Steck in the fieldwork aspect of this. I apologize in advance if there are any questions I'm not able to fully answer because it might have fallen on another team member's domain, but I will certainly do my best. And sometimes the advancing of slides is a little bit delayed, so apologies if there's a little bit of a lag in between slides. So in this presentation, I'll walk you through a pretty standard format for evaluation findings and give you the opportunity to share questions at the end, as Holly mentioned. And I'm happy that our colleagues from the USAID mission in Indonesia, and I believe the implementer of this project, have also joined the webinar, so we may have the opportunity to hear from them during the Q&A at the end. As Oliver mentioned, I represent the Water Communications and Knowledge Management Project, which supports several knowledge management and sharing activities for the USAID Water Office. CKM is responsible for globalwaters.org and several newsletters you may subscribe to, such as Water Currents. And another CKM activity, which is done in partnership with my organization, Social Impact, is this series of 6 evaluations where we're looking back on USAID WASH activities that closed 3 to 10 years ago. And our goal here is to learn about what has and has not been sustained and why we found those things. So our hope here is that we can inform more sustainable activity design in the future for USAID, but of course, the applications may be more broad than within USAID alone. So the program we evaluated, I'll refer to it as ESP. It was the Environmental Services Program, implemented by DAI from 2004 to 2010. And we did this evaluation in 2017. So we came in 7 years later. And this was a very large program with around 55 million in budget and operations across 10 provinces. ESP had a lot of components, and it took a holistic approach that included a variety of things, including water resource conservation at the source and kind of trying to link that with water service delivery in urban areas. So please do bear in mind that some of this budget presented here went to watershed management activities, while another portion went to water supply interventions. Despite the multifaceted intervention, our evaluation had to take a bit of a narrow focus on activities that were focused on urban utility capacity building, as well as efforts to improve access for the poor. So we tried to constrain it to sort of a bundle of activities that all kind of fit together. And ESP worked to strengthen water utilities in a variety of ways. First, they worked to strengthen management capacity. This included things like needs assessments, trainings, developing standard operating procedures. They also worked to strengthen financial stability. This was done through things like energy efficiency audits that might identify ways to reduce costs at the utilities, tariff restructuring, trainings, debt restructuring support. They also work to improve access to finance at utilities, working to strengthen their creditworthiness and financial management, developing business plans, finance plans for new investment. It included things like obtaining credit ratings in some selected utilities to enable them to access market-based finance. And then they also work to monitor strengths and weaknesses, primarily through an annual performance index, which is a metric I believe DAI designed in order to gauge strengths and weaknesses. And this spanned a variety of categories, things like tariffs, whether there was a business plan and whether it was updated, non-revenue water mitigation efforts, water quality monitoring, the strength of their management information system, finance, operating ratios, human resources policies. A variety of categories comprised this single index metric. And you'll see that we adopted this performance index as our way of checking in 7 years later on how the supported utilities continued to perform. So that was on the utility side over here. And then on the access to the poor side, ESP developed a microcredit program that was designed to reduce financial barriers to connecting to public water utilities. So this evaluation looks at those activities as well. A perennial challenge to carrying out a sustainability evaluation, as you can imagine, is the fact that often follow-on or otherwise similar projects are implemented in the same sites after the project ends. So if we were to go to the sites that had follow-on projects, it would obviously be difficult to assess whether the outcomes relate specifically to ESP activities or if they were really due to the follow-on activities. So we restricted our sampling frame to only utilities that ESP supported that had not benefited from follow-on WASH interventions. And then beyond that, we also excluded those that had been impacted by the 2004 tsunami, as the post-disaster context we felt made sites like Aceh a bit hard to compare and kind of made them stand apart a bit too much. So in the end, there were 8 eligible utilities, and we included all of them in data collection. These utilities were split between West and Central Java, as shown on these maps. And the specific utilities are circled here in yellow. Sorry, I'm trying to advance the slide. It's taking a minute. Okay, sorry about that. So we aimed to answer these evaluation questions. First, to what extent are the levels of water service provided by ESP water-related project components at the time of project closure still observed 7 years later? So what's the status of water access now? And then as part of that, we wanted to look specifically at the proportion of the catchment population with connections, and then also looking at the sustainability of utility capacity. Have they maintained or improved their management capacity as measured at the end of the project? And then have communities continued the use of microcredit for connections to the poor? And then the other overall question was just which factors or approaches contributed to what we found. So that's sort of asking the why question. We adopted a mixed methods approach with qualitative interviews seeking both institutional and consumer perspectives. And then on the quantitative side, to measure population access to water utilities, we compared official government performance data from a report we'll call BPKP. It's a Bahasa name that unfortunately I can't pronounce, so I won't bother to butcher it. And these data came from 2010 and 2015. So around the time that the project ended and as current as we could get it. Unfortunately, more recent data weren't available at the time of our evaluation in 2017. And then to measure utility performance, we implemented a slightly modified version of the same performance index tool that I mentioned before. This was the one that was done at utilities at the end of the project, and we tried to compare our results to what happened circa 2010. So our aim was to see if those levels of capacity were maintained, if not improved upon. And just to clarify what the tool entailed, it was a series of yes, no, and multiple questions about utility procedures with some additional questions requiring data review from performance and financial reports. And then during our interviews, the team also requested 2016 reports. However, it turns out they weren't available for most utilities, unfortunately. So we had to adapt and use a hybrid approach where several performance index data points came from in-person interviews with utility staff, and the remaining quantitative data points came from a 2015 government-led performance audit that was available to us. So this 2-year time gap in the index components is a limitation I want to point out. There are naturally other limitations to this tool. For example, while we tried to interview multiple utility staff with knowledge of the topic, lacking knowledge or other response bias could certainly have affected the validity of our results, just as it could have influenced the 2010 results that DAI collected, to which we compared our findings. So just bear in mind those types of limitations with this metric. So let's look at results. How did the level of utility water access change since ESP ended? We looked at the number of connections to see if utilities were expanding their net, but also the proportion to see if they were keeping up with population growth. I consider the latter metric to be the most important. So the left column over here refers to location names of utilities. KAB stands for Kabupaten. This is a local name that represents regency or district, and Kota is short for city. And you'll see the column title PDAM This is the local term, an acronym for the utility, which again is based on a Bahasa name. Unfortunately, I can't pronounce. So occasionally I might refer to PDUMs, just interchange that with the word utility. It's the same thing. So as you can see in this table, 6 of the 8 PDUMs in the sample increased the proportion of households with a connection, and 2 slightly decreased. And there are a couple odd things worth noting. So first, you might wonder what's going on here in Kabupaten Bogor, where you have this discrepancy between the coverage and the number of connections. We learned that in 2012, this split into 2 separate utilities. So Kabupaten Bogor is now Kabupaten Bogor and Kota Depok. This split explains the decrease in the number of household connections since 2010 because the actual population in the coverage catchment decreased significantly. So I do want to point out that anomaly there. And then also the Kota Yogyakarta utility was the only one in the sample to experience declines in both coverage and number of connections. So we wondered what's going on here. Through qualitative interviews, we learned that the mayor directed the utility to focus on increasing water access for commercial consumers, like hotels, rather than residential. Kota Yogyakarta is a bit of a tourist area, so that was a decision that was made by the local government, and most likely explains why there was such a decrease there. Numbers are well and good, but what do the customers say about water access? All customers and FGDs unfortunately noted a lot of problems with water outages and low water pressure. Some complained of quality concerns like strange odor and taste. I should mention that private wells are very common in urban Indonesia, and even utility customers tend to also use well water at times, and people tend to interchange sources. Both utility staff and customers alike alluded to spikes and declines in the demand for connections based on whether well water was seasonally available or clean. So these quotes are great summaries of rational customer decisions to choose water sources based on service quality. And this quote in gray shows that water outages or low pressure is driving her to use wells. And in blue, this customer is highlighting the balance of affordability with quality. How have the utilities maintained or improved management and finance capacity? This goes back to one of our evaluation questions. We were able to plot biannual performance index data from the time that ESP was implemented from 2004 through 2010, and then compare it to present day. And that's this gap shown in the box. This is really the comparison we're trying to make. The rest of the data is just to kind of give you some context of how the change has happened over time. So there are varied starting and ending points for the data too. I should point that out. And that just reflects the different points in time that ESP began their interventions. So all PDUMs, all utilities demonstrated that there was continued improvement in management capacity through their total performance index scores. That's with the exception of Kota Sukabumi, this one in red, that declined slightly. Average scores increased from 42.3 at the start of ESP engagement, so right around here, to 59.1 at the end of the ESP activity, so that's right around here. And then they reached 67.5 on average at the time of the evaluation. And I should mention that all scores were out of a total of 100, so still there's quite a ways to go in terms of capacity at these utilities. Kota Yogyakarta, Kabupaten Sleman, Kabupaten Bogor, and Kota Magelang. I know these names probably don't mean a lot to those of you not in Indonesia, but anyway, these were sites that demonstrated the greatest continued improvement since 2010. And we'll look at that a little bit closer now. Looking at the categories that comprise the performance index assessment, You can see the average point value change over the last 7 years was 8.4, and here's the breakdown of the different categories and points attributed to each one. Most followed a positive, or at least I would say a nearly neutral trend. Negative 0.1 doesn't say that much to me. However, negative 3.1 does. The financial management had the largest decline by 3.1 points. And, you know, this certainly was the most challenging for utilities to maintain, and I'll unpack that a little bit later. 3.1 for corporate plan was the highest jump, and I think this was a bit more of like a yes, no, do you have a corporate plan that's somewhat updated? So that was doing fairly well. So qualitative interviews shed more light on what's going on behind the scenes in terms of these utility performance metrics. We learned that 3 of the 8 utilities were still using management SOPs, standard operating procedures, and stated by ESP, and they said they found them to be quite useful. And 2 were still using corporate plans introduced by ESP, and they credited them as leading to debt relief and even an expanded customer base. So these were definitely positives. Looking at the customer's perspective of how well utilities are being managed, it's clear that similar to the negative feelings about the service levels, they felt that management needs to improve as well in line with that. We heard those complaints about leaking meters that weren't repaired, poor water quality, as I mentioned. Some complained of high tariffs. Another limitation of our data was that we were sort of forced into allowing the utilities to sit in on customer FGDs. This was not by design, but it was just sort of a scenario we kind of had to agree to. And we feared that this would lead them to censor their criticism, I'm speaking of the customers there. But we learned they didn't hold back any criticism, and were quite critical with the utility managers in the room. So it was interesting to hear that. On the finance side, ESP worked to strengthen the creditworthiness of water utilities by addressing their outstanding debt issues and improving their financial management and access to long-term commercial financing. So in the Indonesian context, utilities have historically been crippled by debt, brought on by a cycle of development bank loans in the 70s. There was the financial crisis in the late 90s that didn't help, and then there have been other issues since then. So at baseline, they were dealing with a whole lot of debt. And as you saw in the prior table, among all aspects of management, water utilities struggled most to improve their financial stability after the closure of ESP. So that figure I showed you with the financial management worsening by 3.1 points, what comprised that was things like the operating ratio, debt service to coverage ratio, the debt equity ratio, and collections. So why was this the case? It's difficult to pinpoint specifically, but it did seem that the amount of baseline debt combined with the prevalence of alternative water sources that cut away at their customer base seems to have constrained utilities' ability to get in a healthier financial standing in the end. And then shifting gears to another financial issue, ESP also worked to lay the groundwork for using municipal bonds to finance water projects. As a first step in the process, ESP managed to get, this is, again, I'm only speaking of the evaluation sample of the 8 utilities that we were addressing. ESP managed to get Kabupaten Bogor through a credit rating process where they got a BBB rating, which is investment grade. And then our evaluation followed up to learn what became of that municipal bond that they hoped would follow. It turns out the bond was never issued, but the utility supervisory, the issue was the utility supervisory board overruled the bond application. In this case, USAID's Development Credit Authority, known as the DCA, offered a guarantee for the bond, and the board for some reason found it suspicious. So not sure what else I can say about that there, or why they had such problems with that, but we did learn that all was not lost, and the utility explained that the credit rating did eventually enable them to access another loan to finance a new wastewater, or sorry, just a water treatment plant. So there still was value in that credit rating process. Sorry about the delay in the slides. Let's see if it goes through now. Okay, here we go. So what about ESP's work to improve access through microcredit? Has the microcredit been used to continue expanding access to household connections? Only 3 sites with microcredit actually fell into our sample, so I should mention that they were sort of minor players among all of ESP's microcredit activities. Collectively, they constituted only 2.6% of the total new connections financed during the lifetime of ESP, so they aren't really super representative of the full microcredit program. That being said, in 2017, we found that of these 3, none were still operational. And in fact, they pretty much ended when ESP ended. It wasn't for lack of demand, because we did learn from bank customers that they still inquire about it. And, from the banks that people still inquire about it. And several customers had favorable things to say as well. So why didn't it persist? Well, we heard reports from banks and customers that the borrowing process was really slow and cumbersome, and it was geared more towards large loans, it seemed. This mismatch meant that the bank either rejected a lot of applicants for lack of trust or spent too much time vetting them. So some microcredit beneficiaries also felt that the advertisement of the microcredit program was insufficient. And some utility staff blamed it on insufficient ESP engagement with the bank. So it seems like a constellation of factors. The largest one that came out was really kind of the bank's vetting processes being a little bit too rigorous. There are still options for the poor to connect, though. Since ESP closed, some water utilities have introduced connection installment plans or discount programs to continue providing options to lower income populations, and these seem to be pretty popular. So let's go back to our overarching question of which factors facilitated or detracted from sustainability in this case. We were able to pinpoint a few helpful things. First, remember the district that I pointed out that used a credit rating to get a loan to finance a water treatment plant. Well, this demonstrated value, we thought, in pursuing market-based resources and taking the steps necessary to access it, such as municipal credit ratings. I'll mention that this is something USAID has supported in other contexts, and we're currently wrapping up an evaluation of a USAID activity in India that focused quite a bit on market-based finance for urban wash. So stay tuned for another webinar where we present the results of that evaluation. Second, you know the adage, what's measured gets managed. What's more, what's incentivized gets managed. Beginning in 2008, the Ministry of Public Works initiated an annual performance report and score that essentially ranks how each utility performs according to certain parameters. And the score categorizes utilities and promises debt forgiveness of well-functioning utilities. The categories of this performance score aligns fairly well with the same types of categories that the performance index that we used applied. So this has been a huge incentive for utilities to continue to improve operational and financial management, especially when they have this potential debt relief dangling in front of them. Third, having accessible tools that met a distinct need and had an enduring presence, as in a manual that could be referenced by future staff, appear to be a helpful thing. To illustrate that, this is a quote from a utility worker who speaks favorably about the SOPs and how they're still used 7 years later. They credit the program's SOPs and technology-based meter reading with improving performance and productivity even to this day. We found several barriers to sustainability. One major issue is that utilities in Indonesia are competing with abundant alternative water resources like wells. And this goes together with environmental factors. So respondents told us about increasing demand for new piped connections when environmental conditions rendered well water unavailable, whereas consumers would often seek to shut off their utility connection when alternative clean sources are abundant. But the underlying message here is also that consumers aren't having a favorable experience with utility water. That's what they told us. So it's inconsistent, sometimes has poor quality. So until utilities can consistently provide a better service, there will always be this push and pull of demand. Next, financial constraints, particularly large-scale debt, are also a huge challenge here. Also, it has to be said that there's rumored to be a good deal of corruption at play, which of course affects these outcomes. Unfortunately, addressing that is above any of our pay grades. So I think, if we'll have to just focus on what we can control, but that certainly is a problem. And then finally, the lack of coordination of water supply programs affected utility services. What do I mean by that? We learned that the central government was funding programs that competed with utilities for customers. For example, in one program, they offered dug wells in areas also served by utilities. In another, they provided free or subsidized water tariffs in areas served by utilities. In this quote, a utility supervisory board member complains about how his utility was forced to lower their tariff because of community complaints when the central government created a program that waived tariffs for some while their neighbors still had to pay the regular fees. I'm not saying this government support is necessarily bad, and it may have been necessary to meet needs, but the community perceptions and long-term business implications for utilities weren't properly vetted and did have implications for utility services and their customers' perceptions. So it is important to note what those implications are and consider whether something different should have been done. So what can we glean from this evaluation that might inform future USAID activity design? First, we felt that capacity building, it's of course common across development projects. We recommend that institutional capacity building efforts go beyond trainings that would easily be forgotten, especially when staff move on, and rather focus on more in-depth manuals, policies, and reference documents that will become ingrained in how utilities do their work. This is a long, supportive process that requires relationship building with utilities, but it's one that paid off long-term dividends for ESP in some cases. Second, microcredit programs didn't have traction in our evaluation sites, and the lesson here seems to be that implementers should more carefully vet bank partners and ensure they're set up for a smaller microcredit space. Third, the fact that the government wasn't really facilitating a cohesive strategy to support long-term viability of piped water shows there's value in donors like USAID potentially playing a role in broader urban planning efforts to help governments mediate between different water supply options, ensure stakeholders are consulted, and plan tariffs and development that ensure sustained piped water services. And finally, based on the findings about DAI's annual performance index and the similar annual government performance audits and the promise of debt relief for good performers, it emphasizes the value of transparency and accountability. In this case, it seemed to be prompting change, especially when tied to incentives. It was modest change for sure, but there did seem to be motivating factors that came across in interviews with utilities. In other urban contexts, this might be a valuable thing to develop in coordination with central governments. So that's the end of my summary. Thanks for listening. I really encourage you to read their full report. If you'd like more details, the link is here. And I think it might have also come through in your invitation to this webinar. Now I'll invite my colleague Tree from the USAID mission in Indonesia to give you a sense of what USAID has been doing since ESP ended. And then following that, I'll hand it over to Holly to moderate any questions you have. Tree, would you like to share something?
Hello, Al. Tree. I manage ESP until the project closed out. So first of all, thanks to the water team and very good job to the evaluation team. It was not an easy task to find relevant people to interview a project that ended 7 years ago. So you're doing great. Since ESP ended, the USAID Indonesia completed one 5-year project, Indonesia Urban Water Sanitation Hygiene, and now we have an ongoing IUWAS Plus. And we accommodated the learning from ESP on the design and the implementation, specifically in defining factors for success or graduation. So I would like to touch a couple of that. First of all, we are still aiming for improved services, and then that means not only increasing the connections, but about more connection with commercially viable utilities that can sustain and scale sustainable access over time. So that can means the planning will be in a much better conditions. We are still utilizing the performance index, but the performance index evolved during IUAS and IUAS Plus according to the program specifics. And then we are aligning that with the Government of Indonesia annual performance data as well. And then we are also making sure that the focus on the raw water availability still be there. So during IUAS, we are doing the climate change vulnerability and action plan. And then we are moving forward to a water safety planning, also the water security during the IUAS Plus, because that's really important for water utility to get sufficient water and the customers can get enough but really good quality of water, which is really on continuous supply. So tackling the improved services will not be enough. That will also need from the development partners a more closer communication and collaboration with government, as the evaluation team found out. So we are doing it closely with government to avoid competing programs, priorities, and correctly place the government subsidy so we can decrease the disparity and impact on the poor. So the evolving during IUAS is the pro-poor target, but IUAS Plus is actually targeting the bottom 40% by wealth population as the high-level beneficiaries. So this is really useful for us as a learning, as moving forward, doing the continuous support to the GOI, aiming for actually the final stage. If a water utility can demonstrate sufficient credit worthiness to obtain external finance, so it will be considered have taken measures to ensure its long-term viability. This is what we aim as a final benchmark of our success and a means by which to assess the graduation capacity from technical assistance. So that's briefly saying how we are learning from the ESP until what we are doing right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tree. I will go ahead and moderate the question and answer session now. So what I did is I have taken the questions that have come in so far and organized them into questions about implementation, methods, and findings. I encourage people to continue to submit questions as we go through the questions that we have so far. So to start, Leslie, the first question we have is, were local governments engaged, and if so, how during the original project? And then a second add-on to that was tourism recognized as a potential competing demand to users during the project?
Those are great questions. Unfortunately, I'm not very privy to the specifics of the implementation modalities. So I would ask if maybe Tree has some insight into that, or perhaps if any other DAI colleagues that happen to be on the call have that at hand. Unfortunately, I don't know.
Yeah, so just quickly to repeat the question, it's essentially, were governments engaged in how during the original project? I guess we could start there. Can anyone, Tree, can you jump in and answer that?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. So during ESP, the site selection is actually not that, we are not doing that as thorough as we are doing it right now. And that's also a learning that we took from ESP. During ESP, which is, Leslie already mentioned in the beginning, that it was a reach to reef project. So doing the watershed management, also the water utilities, we are limited to find the areas that has both upstream and downstream. We are working with the community on the upper watershed area, and also there is a water utilities that we can work with on improving their services. So that kind of thing was still fake in the beginning. So we can just go and then looking for the area fulfilling the criteria that we want to work during ESP. The learning that we are taking from ESP, now we are looking for the partners, local governments who are really committed to achieve the joint objectives. So that's how we are gaining a really stronger commitment from our current partners right now.
Excellent, thank you very much. Okay, so now we have two other questions that relate to water utilities and implementation. So specifically, we'll start with the first one, which is, did utility managers receive leadership training as part of the intervention or implementation? Should we ask Tree to jump in on this?
Yeah, Tree, you're welcome to jump in. I'm sure you will have a more complete answer than I do. But my understanding is that yes, there was certainly training involved at the utilities, and it covered a variety of topics. And I believe leadership was included, but Tree can comment on that.
Leadership was included, but we missed to include the supervisory board. So that's also a great learning for us. The leadership right now is evolving. Every head of the local government owned water utilities needs to go through fit and proper tests. In the past, the head of the water utilities can be anyone connected to the head of local governments. So during ESP, that's also some of the limitation that we have to face in the field. Not always the professional heading the utilities.
Okay, thank you. And we just have one more question related to implementation, and then I'll move on to methods and findings. Certainly, I see more coming in, so I will weave those in if they have to do with methods later. The second question, or the final question related to methods, is, was there microbiological and chemical water quality testing? And what was the quality of utility water, and how did it compare to the quality of other water sources, such as well water?
We didn't check the water quality from the source until the water that's received by the customers, but we are really sure that the water coming out from the outlet of the water treatment plant is actually the quality of the clean and safe water. But going through the distribution network, and this is something that we are still working with, is actually the quality is reduced, and then the quality coming out from the tap is really sometimes bad during the rainy seasons because of the high turbidity. And then if we are not taking care of sanitation, that will also be contaminated with the E. coli and other microorganisms.
Thank you. That's helpful.
And Tree, could you comment on the so the well sources throughout Indonesia? My understanding is they tend to be covered wells, protected wells. Can you confirm that?
Not all are protected wells. So during ESP, we also have the GDA with Coca-Cola that also protected the wells that owned by the communities. So first of all, not all protected, but also the sanitation was actually not really in a good situation. So evolving from ESP to IUAS and IUAS Plus, USAID Indonesia has more and more focus on sanitation, because we cannot really take care of the supply of clean water if we are not doing the safely managed sanitations. So the sanitation facility will keep contaminating the groundwater and also will infect the source of the water supply.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, and then the next question has to do with gender and gender empowerment. And is there any component in the utilities, the evaluation of the utilities management capacity that looked at gender empowerment and gender equity within the utilities?
Sorry, unfortunately, no, there was not a part of the performance index that captured that.
Okay, thank you. And then the next questions, we're going into the findings. So regarding financial stability, did you identify any ESP interventions that were particularly successful? So either at implementation now or after the project?
particularly successful components of the intervention, is the question?
So my understanding based off of what we have written here is regarding financial sustainability. So was there any particular piece of the intervention that was successful related to financial sustainability?
I see. I mean, I think the best example was the credit rating that was done in Kabupaten Bogor, I believe it was, where they were able to access a loan to finance water treatment plants. I mean, this was the biggest impact, certainly. And other than that, unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot of information that the utilities could provide related to any specific financial management methods that had been particularly useful.
Okay, great, thank you. And then another question, which I think will be, it's very interesting, but I'm not sure of the answer, is did the evaluation have scope to assess the influence of the political process over utilities after the closure of ESP?
I wish we did, but oh, go ahead, Tree.
Yeah, there's one political decision that really impact the result, the proliferation of the local governments. So that's something that whenever there's a proliferation of local governments, each of the new local governments, they want to have their own water utility, because in the past they see them as the cash cow for every expense that they may have. So that kind of things, it's not really good in terms of the scale of economy. So one thing for sure, we have to make sure that the scale of economy of the utility will still be there, and then there'll be no kind of political decision to influence.
Okay, thank you. I think that
yeah, I
that
don't really
answers
have
the
anything
question.
to add other than just that, we didn't specifically set out to assess the political climate, but some things did come through in interviews. For example, learning that of the division of one of the utilities into two, and some of the other administrative decisions to focus on one thing versus another in the case of Yogyakarta.
Yeah, one question I had, Leslie, just in listening myself, that's kind of adds on to this is, could you just give a little bit more of a background on who manages at the national level the water sector? So you talked about this tension between utilities and dug wells, for example, and who manages that overall strategy in this context?
Tree, would you like to take that? You can probably answer the best.
Yes, water flows to everywhere. So that's how the ministries in Indonesia also got one of the parts to take care. Technically, it's with Ministry of Public Works and Housing, but status of the water utilities, since they are all owned by local governments, it's Ministry of Home Affairs. But the quality resides with the Ministry of Health. So we have to have the interministerial working group to make sure that we can touch into every aspect of the water service delivery.
Thank you. That's very helpful context. Okay, and for the next question, we're going to talk about watershed resources. So the question specifically says, you mentioned that projects incorporated an integrated approach to watershed resource management. Is there any evidence that this approach helped improve the long-term sustainability and success for water access?
The watershed component was not within the scope of our evaluation, unfortunately. So I really can't comment on that. Tree may have an impression, so you're welcome to weigh in on that as well, Tree.
Briefly, working with communities in upper watershed to really give more and better treatment to the environment. The access to the water is actually a really good entry point for them to do better conservation efforts. So we can do the environmental financing from the upper watershed to the downstreams in much better, because people understand what they are doing is actually benefiting the downstream population, but they'll also get the benefit because they'll get the continuous supply of water within the area.
Great. Thank you. And we are almost out of time, so I'm just going to try to squeeze in the last two questions that we have. I think I'll have covered most of them. One of the final questions kind of goes back to implementation, but did the utilities maintain customer hotlines so that customers could report problems? And did they track the customer's complaints and then the utilities response thereafter?
The index did capture those types of activities, customer response, but I don't really have the data to specify. I would have to look back into the data to see how many actually reported having that kind of mechanism. The index combined that with a few other customer service types of data points, but yeah, I think some of them did have some sort of customer feedback mechanism. Tree, feel free to weigh in.
Yes, the feedback mechanism is one of the quality that we want to improve the service of water utility. And that's also part of the index, even though that appears as one of the SOP, but that's something that we are improving from the water utilities operational.
Great, thank you. And so just the final question, I think we're going to be able to squeeze them all in. So this last question is about WASH activities, and it specifically says, how can WASH activities be sustainable in terms of managing water resources and in terms of developing livelihoods that can pay for water services? I think that's a very big question. So please feel free to try to answer it, but I myself understand this is quite a broad question.
Payment for environmental services is actually what's linking upper watershed with downstream. And then we have a couple of success, not always, but private sector is actually our good partner on doing this kind of thing.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, so that is it for the questions. I want to thank all the participants who submitted questions. They were great questions and I think very useful to expand on the presentation that Leslie gave to further everyone's understanding of this project and the general sector. As a close to the webinar today, please look forward to an email follow-up that will have a link to the recording for everyone to be able to go over the material in case you missed anything or want to review any resources. On behalf of Leslie, the water team at USAID, and everyone else who put this seminar together, I want to thank everyone for your participation today and for joining us, and wish you all a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.